This morning, while most of the world was watching the Iran ceasefire negotiations collapse for the third time in 10 days, the United States Treasury Department quietly did something that should have made every headline on Earth. It sanctioned 12 Chinese companies and individuals for helping Iran sell its oil. Not Iranian companies, Chinese ones. Companies in Hong Kong, companies in the UAE, a company in Oman, and 3 senior officials of the IRGC's Shahid Purjafari oil headquarters, the unit inside the Revolutionary Guard that runs Iran's entire shadow oil export operation. The Treasury called it part of Operation Economic Fury. The timing officially is coincidental. It is not coincidental. In 48 hours, Donald Trump boards Air Force One to Beijing, and this morning's sanctions are not a routine enforcement action. They are the opening bid of the most consequential diplomatic meeting since the Cold War ended. The oil pipeline Beijing doesn't want to talk about. To understand why this morning's sanctions matter and why Beijing will walk into Wednesday's summit furious about them, you need to understand the economic relationship that sits at the center of the entire Iran war. China is buying 80 to 90% of Iran's oil exports, every barrel, every day. Before the war started on February 28th, China was purchasing an average of 1.38 million barrels of Iranian oil per day. Discounted, sanctions-busting crude moved through a shadow fleet of vessels that switch off their transponders, conduct ship-to-ship transfers in international waters, and arrive at Chinese independent refineries, known as teapot refineries, with falsified documentation listing the cargo as oil from Malaysia or Oman or any other origin that isn't Iran. This is not a secret. The Treasury knows it, the CIA knows it. Every major energy analytics firm, Kepler, Fortexa, S&P Global, tracks it in near real time from satellite imagery and port data. The shadow fleet is not shadowy to anyone who is looking. What has changed since February 28th is the stakes. Before the war, Iran's oil exports to China were a sanctions evasion problem. After the war, they are a war financing problem. Every barrel of Iranian crude that reaches a Chinese refinery is a barrel that funds the IRGC, that funds the fast attack boats in the Strait of Hormuz, that funds the drones hitting UAE infrastructure, that funds the continued closure of a waterway that is costing American consumers $37 billion in extra energy costs since February 28th, $284 per American household, according to Brown University's Iran War Energy Cost Tracker. China is not a neutral bystander in this war. China is its primary financier. The U.S. administration has been escalating pressure on Beijing over this for weeks. In April, Treasury sanctioned Hengli Petrochemical, one of China's largest independent refineries, for buying billions of dollars worth of Iranian crude. Treasury also sent warning letters directly to 2 Chinese banks, putting them on notice that secondary sanctions, the kind that cut institutions off from the U.S. financial system entirely, were coming if they continued facilitating Iranian trades. Beijing's response was immediate and unprecedented. China's Ministry of Commerce formally ordered its companies not to comply with the U.S. sanctions, not quietly, not through back channels, publicly, in writing, invoking a blocking law that allows Beijing to legally retaliate against any entity that enforces U.S. sanctions that China deems unlawful on its territory. That response, from a country that has never before invoked that law against the United States, is the geopolitical backdrop against which today's new sanctions and Wednesday's summit must be understood.
Washington is sanctioning Beijing's refiners. Beijing is ordering its companies to ignore Washington's sanctions. This is not a trade dispute. This is a sovereign confrontation over who has the authority to regulate commerce with a country that is actively at war with the United States. And it is happening 48 hours before the 2 men at the center of it sit down at the same table. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said publicly that Trump will use the Beijing meeting to press Xi to join us in this international operation to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. That sentence contains a remarkable assumption. that China, which has been buying Iran's oil at a discount and telling its companies to ignore US sanctions, is going to volunteer to help the United States end a war that is, financially speaking, extremely good for Beijing. Iranian oil at a war discount is cheaper for Chinese refineries. A closed Hormuz is not China's problem. China's own oil imports come predominantly through the Malacca Strait, not Hormuz. The pain of the Hormuz closure falls primarily on Europe, Japan, South Korea, and the United States. China is, at present, an economic beneficiary of the war it is nominally trying to help end. What China wants from this summit is different and more strategically significant. Beijing has reportedly pressed the Trump administration to scale back its security commitments to Taiwan and revise official US policy toward the island. Last month, Xi met with Cheng Li-won, chairwoman of Taiwan's biggest opposition party, the Kuomintang, in Beijing, signaling that China intends to use the summit to push its Taiwan agenda through every available diplomatic channel simultaneously. The implicit offer on the table from Beijing is one that Trump administration officials have been privately discussing for weeks. China helps end the Iran war diplomatically. China gets meaningful movement on Taiwan. An unofficial, unwritten, entirely plausible exchange of concessions that neither government will ever acknowledge in public, but that every serious analyst in Washington and Beijing is currently modeling. The problem is that Taiwan is not a bargaining chip in the way that trade tariffs are a bargaining chip. Taiwan is a democracy of 23 million people that makes the majority of the world's advanced semiconductors. A US security retreat from Taiwan in exchange for Chinese mediation on Iran would be the most consequential geopolitical trade since Nixon went to Beijing in 1972. And it would be conducted, if it happens, in the space of a 2-day summit by two leaders who have demonstrated consistently that they are willing to move faster than their respective bureaucracies can process the consequences. Buried in this week's pre-summit coverage, reported by CNN and confirmed by 3 sources with knowledge of recent intelligence assessments, is a finding that has received almost no attention relative to its strategic significance. US intelligence indicates that China is preparing to deliver new air defense systems to Iran. Not already delivered, preparing to deliver. The distinction matters. It means there is still a window, and that window closes the moment Trump lands in Beijing if he doesn't address it directly. If China delivers advanced air defense systems to Iran, it restores, in part, the air defense capability that US and Israeli strikes destroyed in the early weeks of the war. It makes future American or Israeli strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, the strikes that have been threatened, planned, and so far held in reserve as diplomatic leverage, significantly more costly. It changes the military calculus of the entire conflict. And it would represent China crossing a line that every US administration since the Gulf War has treated as a bright red one: the direct transfer of advanced weapons systems to a country actively at war with American forces. This is not arms sales to a neutral party. This is weapons delivery to an enemy combatant while the shooting is still happening. It is, by any reasonable legal or military definition, an act of material support for a belligerent power in an active conflict involving US forces. Trump will have this intelligence in front of him in Beijing. Whether he raises it directly and how Xi responds may be the single most important exchange of the entire summit. Because if China proceeds with the delivery after the summit, the US-China relationship does not return to managed competition. It becomes something else, something that the current diplomatic vocabulary does not yet have a clean word for. The ceasefire dimension: why nothing moves until Beijing. A regional diplomatic source told CNN on Monday that the Iran peace talks are unlikely to make significant progress until Trump meets Xi in Beijing. That assessment tells you everything about the structure of this negotiation. Iran's survival, economically, militarily, politically, runs through Beijing. China buys Iran's oil. China provides Iran's industrial imports. China has blocked every UN Security Council resolution that would have formalized international pressure on Tehran.
As long as China is buying Iranian crude at war discount prices and ordering its companies to ignore U.S. sanctions, Iran has no material incentive to make serious concessions at the negotiating table. The economic siege that the U.S. naval blockade is trying to impose is being partially neutralized by the Chinese economic lifeline. Until that lifeline is either maintained, expanded, or withdrawn, a decision that would be made or signaled in Beijing, Iran's negotiating position does not fundamentally change. Trump knows this. He called Iran's latest proposal garbage this morning, escalating from Sunday's totally unacceptable, and said he was considering resuming Operation Project Freedom, the naval escort mission he paused last week under Saudi pressure. The escalation in language, timed to the same day as the new China sanctions, is deliberate. Trump is walking into Beijing with maximum pressure deployed on both Iran and China simultaneously. He wants Xi to understand that the alternative to a deal, any deal, is a resumption of full military operations, secondary sanctions that could cut Chinese banks off the dollar system, and a U.S.-China relationship that deteriorates faster than any summit can repair. The Beijing summit is not a peace conference. It is a negotiation between two powers about who controls the economic and military architecture of the post-war Middle East and what that control costs each of them in their primary bilateral relationship. Iran is the subject, Taiwan is the price, and the Strait of Hormuz is the currency.
What success looks like and what failure does. The optimistic scenario for the next 48 hours. Trump and Xi reach a private understanding. China agrees to use its leverage over Tehran to push Iran toward a realistic nuclear concession, specifically a suspension of enrichment for a period longer than Iran's current offer, but shorter than the U.S.'s 20-year demand. In exchange, the U.S. pauses secondary sanctions on Chinese refiners, and Trump offers language on Taiwan that is ambiguous enough for Beijing to call progress without actually changing the U.S. security commitment. The Strait of Hormuz reopens within 2 weeks. Brent crude falls back toward $80. American gas prices start their slow retreat from $4.52. The Trump administration declares victory. China declares it preserved its strategic partnership with Iran while avoiding a broader war. Everyone gets something. No one gets everything. The analysts at Teneo called it this week a managed détente with thin deliverables. It is the best plausible outcome. It is not guaranteed. The pessimistic scenario. Trump and Xi fail to reach even a minimal understanding. China refuses to apply meaningful pressure on Iran. Trump resumes Project Freedom and the full naval escort operation, triggering a new round of IRGC attacks and U.S. retaliatory strikes. Secondary sanctions hit Chinese banks. Beijing responds by accelerating the delivery of air defense systems to Iran. The ceasefire collapses entirely. Oil goes to $120. The U.S. economy enters a supply-side inflationary shock that makes the post-COVID price surge look manageable. And the U.S.-China relationship, the most important bilateral relationship in the world, enters a phase of open confrontation that the global rules-based order, already damaged, may not survive intact. Between those two scenarios lies the actual summit. 2 men, 2 days, a dining table in the Diaoyutai State Guesthouse, and a decision tree whose branches extend to every economy, every navy, every semiconductor factory, and every gas pump on the planet. Here is where we stand on the morning of May 12, 2026. 12 Chinese entities sanctioned this morning. Iran's ceasefire on massive life support, Brent crude at $104, American households down $284 since February, U.S. intelligence tracking a Chinese weapons shipment to Iran, Taiwan on the summit agenda, and in 48 hours, the 2 most powerful men on Earth sit down in Beijing to decide how much of this is a crisis and how much of it is the new normal. The world will be watching. The oil market will be watching harder. And every analyst who spent the last decade modeling US-China relations as managed competition is going to find out in the next 48 hours whether that model still holds. One question: if Trump gets a real commitment from Xi to pressure Iran at the summit, comment deal. If you think Xi gives nothing on Iran and takes everything he can on Taiwan, comment Beijing wins. Stay sharp. The next 48 hours will define the next 48 months.